Hello, for those that don't know me, my name is Kate Bryant. I'm the Head of Non-Ionising Radiation at the University Hospital of Wales, and I'm also the Training Coordinator for the All Wales STP Training Consortium. So I'm going to provide you with an update on STP training, in particular focusing on some of the changes around the curricula and changes occurring at the National School. The All Wales Training Consortium has this year been updated, so we now have 5 medical physics and clinical engineering training centres across Wales, with the new addition being Hywel University Health Board. So the accreditation for the All Wales Training Consortium was updated in March last year and now includes the Medical Device and Risk Management and Governance at Hywel University Health Board, and I also led the accreditation process for HSST accreditation last year, and we're now accredited for radiotherapy, vascular science and rehab engineering at Swansea, Bay, Velindre and Cardiff and Vale. One of the biggest changes this year has been the curriculum review held by the National School. So the National School set up curriculum review panels with representatives from each specialism and from professional bodies, in our case IPEM. The curricula have now been published following consultation. There's no change for existing trainees, so the new syllabus comes into play in 2022, but the new syllabuses are available to view online in the National Schools Curriculum Library so that we can prepare for trainees joining our programme in 2022. Some of the changes to the STP curricula are quite substantial for medical physics and clinical engineering. For example, in medical physics, the imaging with ionising radiation module has been split such that nuclear medicine now sits as a separate rotation and specialism. The diagnostic radiology components of the IAR module have been combined with radiation safety. Radiotherapy remains as a single specialism and has undergone a curriculum update. Imaging with non-ionising radiation also remains, with curriculum update and some structural changes within the module. One of the most substantial changes has been for clinical engineering, where rehab engineering, device risk management and clinical measurement have all merged into a new clinical engineering specialism. In the core modules, there's no longer a requirement for an elective placement, and there's a broad change in approach across all specialisms for the rotations, particularly around timescale for rotations, which has been reduced to about 4 to 8 weeks. And a much more hands-on approach is emphasised throughout. So, for example, attendance at MDTs, observing clinical pathways and performing tasks. This slide illustrates the main changes for the medical physics syllabus. So, as you can see here, nuclear medicine has been split out. So we now have nuclear medicine, radiotherapy physics, radiation safety and diagnostic radiology, and then imaging with non-ionising radiation. The new syllabus has a much stronger emphasis, as I've said, on a hands-on approach and in particular involvement in clinical tasks and duties. So for example, in the new nuclear medicine syllabus, we have attend a nuclear medicine departmental meeting, reflect on the meeting, shadow a technologist or radiographer performing clinical investigations, reflect on their role, etc. So there's a much stronger emphasis on clinical pathways and clinical roles. The radiation protection and diagnostic radiology syllabus has been updated for more hands-on approach and a more of an emphasis across the multidisciplinary team. So, for example, shadowing a radiographer and reflecting on their role. The structure for imaging with non-ionising radiation has changed such that the MRI and ultrasound components have been split within the modules. For optical radiation, lasers and UV sits within the imaging with non-ionising rotation, but then for the specialism sits within radiation safety and diagnostic radiology as previously. The radiotherapy syllabus has been updated in line with current practices, for example, with a much stronger focus on image-guided radiotherapy and with stronger emphasis on quality and improvement for the benefit of the patient. Again, there's much more of an emphasis on working within multidisciplinary teams and involvement in patient pathways. As I said, one of the most substantial changes has been for the clinical engineering syllabus. So 3 of the modules have been merged together with a new clinical engineering specialism. There's an increased focus on computation and data analytics. And a point to note is that rotations are now required outside of clinical engineering, for example, physiological measurement and medical physics. So there's a need to train outside the department and across training centres to meet the training needs. For the core modules, there's no longer a requirement for an elective placement, and we now have 4 core modules, so professional foundations of healthcare and clinical science, research skills in healthcare science, we have the STP project, and individual professional development. Some of the changes to the syllabus, and in particular the reduction in rotational training time, is going to require a different approach towards assessments and one-file evidence. And the National School advise a much more varied approach to assess wider aspects of trainee skill set, for example, communication. So they advise you to be moving away from a standard written report, but instead holding perhaps a face-to-face discussion with a trainee around a topic, which can be recorded and uploaded to one file, or, for example, a PowerPoint presentation. So this not only assesses trainees' competency and understanding of a particular task, but also supports the wider skill set and communication. And this approach can also be much more time effective. So rather than draft reports going back and forth between trainee and supervisor, competencies could be signed off in 1 or 2 discussion sessions or at a single PowerPoint presentation. The final assessments for STPs have changed as a result of the pandemic. It wasn't possible to hold the OSFAs, so they quickly switched to the Independent Assessment of Clinical Competence, or IAC, and then last year they built upon this with an independent interview and range of one-file evidence in addition to the IAC. The school have now published their final assessment criteria for 2022, so it's accepted that trainees may not be able to cover all competencies due to the pandemic, but as a minimum they need to have completed all of the rotational competencies in their own area of specialism, 100% of the Introduction to Healthcare Science Professional Practice and Clinical Leadership module, they need to complete 2 multi-source feedbacks, and then they'll complete the Independent Assessment of Clinical Competence. Alongside this, they then need to complete the Master's degree in Clinical Science, and where all competencies haven't been possible due to the pandemic, a declaration by a registered HCPC clinical scientist in the area of the trainee's specialism is required for sign-off for the National School. Many of our supervisors across Wales have been involved not only in the syllabus review but also in the IACs and the independent interviews for final assessments. This is quite valuable to have our supervisors involved because it provides a really useful insight into the processes and requirements for our own trainees. So I would advise supervisor involvement in this where possible. And some of the supervisors have provided some quite useful feedback from their experience. So for example, for the IAC, project work and practical experience are important, but competencies shouldn't just be about ticking a box. Needs to show clear understanding of the importance of a clinical scientist role within their department and focusing on the scientific work required for a particular post. And routine work experience is important, but trainees need to show the drive for improving quality of services for patient benefit, because this is key to a clinical scientist role. And if this isn't demonstrated within the training experience, then it can be harder for the review panels to determine if a trainee has reached the level expected for a clinical scientist. Just a few comments on recruitment. So in 2021, we had the highest intake of trainees across Wales. We had 12 posts, 6 were STP and 6 were equivalence training routes. The commissioning process for 2022 is due to begin at the end of the year and is closely linked to workforce planning submissions and IMTPs. But I note that 6 of the trainees this year are equivalence trainees, and HIW are now funding equivalence training as a 3-year fixed term funding. So this can either be for in-post applicants, so for example, training via secondment, or for external fixed term appointments. And there are 2 routes for equivalence training, so STP equivalence via the Academy of Healthcare Science, and our more traditional route, which is the Association of Clinical Scientists route 2. So both these routes are now available for equivalence training. The way that trainees register as clinical scientists following successful completion of their training is changing. So the National School has gained education provider status, and this means that HCPC registration can now be directly awarded by certification via the school. So this replaces the current process whereby the National School awards a certificate for the Academy of Healthcare Science, then the Academy of Healthcare Science then awards a further certificate to put forward to HCPC registration. So this essentially removes the Academy of Healthcare Science from the regulatory process for clinical scientist registration. So National School certification based on their completion criteria can now be directly put forward to the HCPC for registration. Other changes at the National School, so they have a new governance structure, which means that the theme board meetings I usually attend as All Wales training coordinator have ceased, and I'm awaiting to hear the terms of reference and new meeting structure following consultation. But it's hoped these meetings will be held again in person soon. But the National School have said that virtual attendance will still remain an option. So that's the end of my brief update. Just to highlight that the National School website does provide a host of information for both trainers and trainees. The events that were previously held face-to-face by the National School, so Train the Trainer events, induction days have now moved online, and the National School do make most of their webinars available after the event if you're unable to attend the live event. So if anybody does have any questions, then please do contact me. But I'd just like to say a big thank you to all involved in training across our centres, both trainees and their supervisors and all staff involved in training, particularly during the pandemic over the last couple of years. So thank you very much, everybody.